Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy watching. The rain drummed against the narrow windows of the Bloomsbury studio, like skeletal fingers tapping insistently for entry. Dr. Margaret Thorne pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders and squinted at the stack of Victorian photographs spread across the cramped desk. The radiator in the corner wheezed and clanked with the rhythm of a dying man's breath, providing barely enough heat to ward off the October chill that seemed to seep through the very bones of the building. She had been in London for 3 weeks now, pursuing her research into the industrial working classes of the 1870s, but the borrowed studio flat felt more like a tomb than a temporary home. The walls, painted a sickly shade of cream that had yellowed with age, seemed to press inward during the long nights when she worked by lamplight. The floorboards creaked with the weight of a century and a half of footsteps, and sometimes, in the small hours when the city finally quieted, she could swear she heard whispers in the walls themselves. Margaret had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of history, the lives that official records overlooked. Her doctoral thesis on Industrial London's Invisible Workers, a study of service labor, 1870 to 1880, had brought her to the archives of the British Library and the London Metropolitan Archives, where she spent her days poring over employment records, accident reports, and the occasional personal diary that had somehow survived the intervening decades. Tonight, however, she was examining a recently acquired collection of photographs that had been donated to the Museum of London by the estate of a deceased collector. The sepia-toned images showed the faces of working-class Londoners, chimney sweeps with soot-blackened faces, flower sellers with weathered hands, and lamp-lighters with their long poles and leather arm guards. It was one of the lamp-lighter photographs that had caught her attention. The man in the image was pale, almost ghostly, with sunken cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. His felt hat was pulled low over his brow, casting his features in shadow. But there was something about his posture, the way he held one hand slightly raised, palm outward, that struck her as significant. The caption beneath the photograph was minimal. Unknown lamplighter, circa 1873, Bloomsbury district. Margaret reached for her magnifying glass and leaned closer. The man's leather arm guards were clearly visible, scored with what appeared to be burn marks from years of working with gas flames and hot oil. But there was something else, something that made her pulse quicken. Around his left wrist, barely visible in the faded photograph, was what appeared to be a bracelet or band of some kind, unusual for a working-class man of that era. She made a note in her research journal. Investigate significance of wrist adornment, possibly protective amulet, connection to other occupational hazards beyond burns. The wind outside intensified, rattling the window frames and sending a draft through the studio that made the lamplight flicker. Margaret glanced up from her work, suddenly aware of how isolated she was 3 floors above the empty street. Her colleague James, who had lent her the studio while he was in Prague for a semester, had warned her that the building was old and full of strange sounds, but she hadn't expected the profound sense of unease that seemed to permeate the place after dark. She returned to her photographs, but found her concentration wavering. The pale face of the lamplighter seemed to draw her gaze repeatedly, as if those hollow eyes were watching her from across the decades. She had seen hundreds of Victorian photographs in her research, but none had affected her quite like this one. There was something almost alive about the image, something that made her feel as though the man might step out of the sepia-toned world and into her lamplit studio. The thought was absurd, of course. Margaret prided herself on her rational, analytical approach to historical research. She dealt in facts, documentation, and verifiable evidence, not romantic notions about photographs coming to life. Yet as she worked into the evening, she found herself glancing repeatedly at the window, half expecting to see a pale face pressed against the glass, watching her with those same hollow eyes. At 11:30, exhaustion finally overtook her curiosity. She carefully arranged the photographs in their protective sleeves and placed them in her research folder. Tomorrow, she would visit the Museum of London to see if they had any additional information about the mysterious lamplighter. But for now, she needed sleep. The studio's small bedroom was barely large enough for the narrow bed and a single wardrobe, but it was marginally warmer than the main room, thanks to an ancient electric heater that glowed like a malevolent eye in the corner. Margaret changed into her nightgown and slipped between the thin sheets, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Sleep, however, proved elusive. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. The settling of the old building, the distant rumble of late-night traffic, the intermittent dripping of water somewhere in the walls. She found herself listening intently, as though waiting for something specific, though she couldn't have said what. It was just past midnight when she heard the first footstep. At first, she dismissed it as the natural creaking of old wood, but then it came again, deliberate, measured, the sound of someone walking slowly across the room above her. But that was impossible. James had assured her that the top floor was vacant, had been for months. The landlord used it for storage, nothing more. Margaret lay still, barely breathing, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth in a regular pattern, as though someone were walking a beat, patrolling. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the October cold. She reached for her phone and activated its flashlight, casting a pale blue glow across the small room. Everything was as she had left it. Her clothes folded on the chair, her suitcase in the corner, the window securely latched. Yet the sense of being watched, of some presence just beyond the reach of her light, was overwhelming. The footsteps stopped. In the sudden silence, Margaret became aware of her own rapid heartbeat, the sound of her breathing, and something else, a faint smell that hadn't been there before. It was acrid and sharp, like burnt oil mixed with something organic and unpleasant. The smell of gas works, perhaps, or the residue of coal smoke that still lingered in London's older buildings. She sat up in bed, pulling the blankets with her, and stared at the ceiling. Nothing but shadows and the faint pattern of water stains that looked in the uncertain light, almost like faces peering down at her. "Hello?" she called softly, feeling foolish even as she spoke. "Is someone there?" No response, but the smell grew stronger, filling the small room until she had to breathe through her mouth to avoid gagging. It was the smell of something burning, something that should not burn, and it carried with it an undertone of decay that made her think of things long dead. Margaret forced herself to get up and check the studio's main room. The lamplight was still on, casting the same warm glow over her research materials, But something had changed. The photograph of the lamplighter, the one that had fascinated her earlier, was no longer in its protective sleeve. Instead, it lay face up on the desk, as though someone had been examining it. She approached the desk cautiously, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The photograph appeared unchanged, but as she leaned over it, she could have sworn she saw the man's raised hand move slightly, just a tremor of the sepia-toned image, as though he were trying to signal her. That was when the fever hit. Chapter 2. Delirium. Margaret awoke to sunlight streaming through the studio windows and a pounding headache that felt like someone was driving railway spikes into her skull. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat despite the room's chill, and when she tried to sit up, the world spun violently around her. The fever had come on with the sudden intensity of a summer storm, transforming what should have been a simple research trip into something far more sinister. She managed to reach for her phone and check the time. Nearly 2 in the afternoon. She had lost most of the day to unconsciousness, and even now, the boundaries between waking and sleeping seemed fluid and unreliable. The walls of the studio appeared to breathe with a slow, organic rhythm, the faded cream paint expanding and contracting like the sides of some vast lung. The water stains on the ceiling had definitely arranged themselves into faces. She was certain of it now, and they watched her with expressions of profound sadness and longing. She attempted to stand, but her legs refused to support her weight. The fever had settled into her bones like molten lead, making every movement an effort. Through the haze of illness, she could smell that same acrid odor from the night before, stronger now, almost overwhelming in its intensity. Margaret crawled to the desk where her research materials lay scattered. The photograph of the lamplighter was still there, but now she could see details that had been invisible before. The burn marks on his leather arm guards formed a pattern, almost like writing in a language she couldn't quite decipher. And his eyes, those hollow, tragic eyes, seemed to follow her as she moved around the room. She reached for her research notebook and tried to write, but her handwriting emerged as illegible scratches and loops. The fever was affecting her motor control, making her feel disconnected from her own body. Yet even through the delirium, her academic instincts remained sharp. There was something important about the lamplighter, something that went beyond mere historical curiosity. The hours blurred together in a kaleidoscope of fever dreams and half-waking visions. Sometimes she was herself, Dr. Margaret Thorne, alone in a Bloomsbury studio in the 21st century. Other times, she was someone else entirely, walking the gas-lit streets of Victorian London with a long pole and a leather satchel full of matches and oil. In these visions, the city was alive, with sounds and smells that no modern person could imagine. The clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, the cry of vendors selling hot pies and roasted chestnuts, the acrid smell of coal smoke mixing with the Thames fog to create a yellowish pall that hung over everything like a shroud. And threading through it all, the hiss of gas lamps coming to life as darkness fell, tiny beacons against the encroaching night. She was the lamplighter in these dreams, making his nightly rounds with practiced efficiency. Each lamp required individual attention, checking the gas flow, cleaning the glass, adjusting the flame for optimal brightness. It was skilled work, despite what the upper classes might think, requiring knowledge of gas pressure, flame dynamics, and the particular quirks of each lamp in the district. But there was danger in the work, always danger. Gas leaks could kill a man in minutes, either through suffocation or explosion. The oil used to maintain the wicks was corrosive and flammable, leaving permanent scars on exposed skin. And there were other hazards, less tangible, but no less real. The things that moved in the shadows between the pools of lamplight, the whispers that came from empty alleyways, the sense of being watched by eyes that reflected no light. Margaret jerked awake, or perhaps fell asleep. The distinction had become meaningless, to find herself standing by the window. The sun was setting, painting the London sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of gas flames. Below, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, though they were electric now, not gas. Progress, she supposed, though something had been lost in the transition. The warm, living light of gas flames had given way to the cold efficiency of electricity. She turned away from the window and froze. He was standing in the corner of the room, exactly as he appeared in the photograph, but somehow more substantial, more present. The pale lamplighter, with his felt hat and leather arm guards, his hollow eyes fixed on her with an expression of infinite patience and urgent need. Margaret tried to speak, but no sound emerged from her throat. The fever had stolen her voice along with her strength, leaving her to communicate through gestures and expressions, like a mime in some grotesque theater. The lamplighter raised one hand slowly, palm outward, in the same gesture she had noticed in the photograph. It was a signal she recognized from her research, a warning used by gas workers when they detected a dangerous leak. Be silent. Be still. Be careful. She wanted to ask him what he was warning her about, what danger lurked in this small studio, 3 floors above a quiet Bloomsbury street. But even as she formed the questions in her mind, he began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, until only the impression of his presence remained. The smell of burning oil intensified, filling the room until she was forced to open the window to breathe. Cold October air rushed in, clearing her head momentarily and allowing her to think with something approaching clarity. This was fever delirium, nothing more. Her overheated brain was creating visions from the historical materials she had been studying, projecting her research obsessions onto the mundane reality of a rented studio. It was a common enough phenomenon. She had read about it in medical journals, the way illness could blur the boundaries between study and hallucination. Yet even as she rationalized the experience, she found herself searching the room for any physical evidence of the lamplighter's presence. The photographs were still scattered on the desk, but now she noticed something she had missed before. The image of the mysterious lamplighter was dated October 15th, 1873, exactly 152 years ago to the day. Margaret sank into the desk chair, her legs finally giving way entirely. The coincidence was unsettling, but not necessarily significant. Many historical photographs were dated approximately, and it was entirely possible that the museum's archivists had simply estimated the date based on other contextual clues. She reached for her laptop and began to search for more information about lamplighters in the Bloomsbury district during the 1870s. The fever made concentration difficult, but she managed to navigate to the London Metropolitan Archives online database and begin cross-referencing employment records with incident reports. What she found made her blood run cold, despite the fever burning through her veins. On October 16, 1873, the day after the photograph was presumably taken, a massive gas explosion had rocked a boarding house in Bloomsbury, killing 12 residents and injuring dozens more. The cause was listed as a faulty gas line that had been leaking for days, filling the building's lower floors with combustible vapors. But it was the witness testimony that made Margaret's hands shake as she read. Multiple survivors reported that a lamplighter had come to their doors in the hours before the explosion, trying desperately to warn them of the danger. He had pounded on doors, shouted warnings, even broken windows in an attempt to rouse the sleeping residents. Most had dismissed him as drunk or mad, slamming their doors in his face. The lamplighter's body was found in the rubble of the boarding house, apparently killed while trying to evacuate the remaining residents. His name was listed as William Harwick, age 34, employed by the Metropolitan Gas Works. He left behind a widow and 3 young children. Margaret stared at the screen until the words began to blur together. The address of the destroyed boarding house was given as 47 Cartwright Gardens, the exact location of her current studio building. Chapter 3. The Archive. The fever broke on the 4th day, leaving Margaret weak but clear-headed for the first time since her arrival in London. She had lost nearly a week to illness, and her research schedule was hopelessly behind. But she found herself consumed by a new obsession that had nothing to do with her original thesis. William Harwick. The name echoed in her mind as she made her way through the gray London morning to the London Metropolitan Archives. The building, a modern glass and steel structure that stood in stark contrast to the Victorian neighborhoods surrounding it, housed one of the most comprehensive collections of historical documents in the world. If there were answers to be found about the mysterious lamplighter, they would be here. The reading room was nearly empty at this early hour, with only a few dedicated researchers hunched over their laptops and document boxes. Margaret had called ahead to request access to the gas works employment records and incident reports from the 1870s, and the archival assistant, a young man with thick-rimmed glasses and an earnest manner, was waiting for her with 3 boxes of material. Dr. Thorne? I'm David Mills, the research assistant who spoke with you on the phone. I've pulled everything we have relating to the Metropolitan Gas Works for the period you requested, though I should warn you that the records are somewhat fragmentary. There was a fire in their offices in 1891 that destroyed many of the earlier files. Margaret thanked him and settled into a corner desk with the first box. The documents were yellowed with age and written in the meticulous copperplate script of Victorian clerks, but they were legible and surprisingly detailed. Employment records, disciplinary notices, accident reports, and occasional personal correspondence painted a picture of an industry that was both vital to London's growth and incredibly dangerous to its workers. She found William Harwick's employment record in the second box. He had been hired by the gas works in January 1869 as a junior lamplighter and had worked his way up to senior lamplighter by 1872. His supervisor's notes described him as reliable and conscientious, with an excellent knowledge of gas systems and safety procedures. There were no disciplinary actions in his file, and his attendance record was exemplary. But it was in the incident reports that Margaret found the most interesting information. William Harwick's name appeared dozens of times, always in connection with gas leak discoveries and evacuations. He had an uncanny ability to detect gas leaks before they became dangerous, often rousing entire buildings in the middle of the night to prevent explosions. His colleagues had nicknamed him the Nose for his ability to smell even the faintest trace of escaping gas. The final entry in his file was a commendation written by his supervisor, dated October 15th, 1873, the same date as the photograph Margaret had found. William Harwick demonstrated exceptional bravery and dedication to public safety during the Cartwright Gardens incident. Despite repeated threats and abuse from residents, he continued his efforts to warn of the gas leak until the very moment of the explosion. His sacrifice saved countless lives, and he died as he lived, in service to his fellow Londoners. Margaret leaned back in her chair, processing what she had read. The official records painted a picture of a hero.
"What happens now?" Margaret asked as they reached the studio. "I'll file my report and arrange for the repairs. Should be fixed within a few days, but the gas will have to stay off until then. You might want to find alternative accommodation. This place will be pretty cold without gas heating." Margaret nodded absently. She had already decided to extend her stay in London, but not in this building. There were too many unanswered questions, too many mysteries surrounding William Harwick and his connection to this place. She needed to dig deeper into the archives to understand not just what had happened in 1873, but why it seemed to be happening again. After Sarah Chen left, Margaret packed her research materials and personal belongings. She had found a small hotel near the British Museum that would serve her purposes better anyway, and the change of scenery might help her process everything she had learned. But as she prepared to leave the studio for the last time, she paused by the window overlooking Cartwright Gardens. The street was quiet in the afternoon light, with only the occasional pedestrian hurrying past. Yet she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched, that somewhere in the shadows between the buildings, a pale figure in a felt hat was observing her departure with those same hollow, grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room. "Thank you for the warning." The studio remained silent, but Margaret could swear she felt a presence retreating, as though a long-held vigil was finally ending. William Harwick had done his job once more, and perhaps now he could rest. Chapter 5. The Pattern. The Russell Hotel in Bloomsbury was exactly what Margaret needed. Comfortable, quiet, and most importantly, constructed well after the Victorian era. Her room overlooked Russell Square with its neat gardens and Georgian facades, a view that was both calming and inspiring. She had been there for 3 days, recovering from her ordeal at Cartwright Gardens and planning her next research moves. The experience with the gas leak had fundamentally changed the direction of her work. Her original thesis on industrial workers seemed suddenly inadequate, too narrow in scope to encompass what she had discovered. Instead, she found herself drawn to a larger question. Were there other cases like William Harwick's, other instances where workers had died trying to protect a public that refused to listen? She had arranged to meet with Dr. Eleanor Fairfax, a senior curator at the Museum of London who specialized in Victorian social history. Eleanor was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp intelligence, someone who had spent decades studying the dark corners of London's past. They met at the museum's research center, a quiet space away from the public galleries where serious scholars could examine historical materials without distraction. "I've been following your work on industrial workers," Eleanor said, as they settled into a corner table with coffee and Margaret's research files. "Fascinating material. But David Mills at the archives mentioned you've developed a particular interest in lamplighters?" Margaret had prepared a carefully edited version of her story, one that emphasized the historical evidence while omitting her supernatural encounters. I came across the case of William Harwick, the lamplighter who died in the Cartwright Gardens explosion in 1873. The more I research him, the more I wonder if his story represents a larger pattern of ignored warnings. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Oh, yes, William Harwick. I remember that case from my graduate work years ago. Tragic story. He tried so hard to save those people. But what do you mean by a pattern? Margaret opened her laptop and pulled up the research she had compiled over the past few days. I've been cross-referencing industrial accident reports with contemporary newspaper accounts, and I'm finding similar cases across different occupations. Workers who detected danger early and tried to warn others, only to be dismissed as alarmist or ignored entirely. She showed Eleanor a timeline she had constructed, marking dozens of incidents from the 1870s. A mill worker who warned about structural weaknesses before a floor collapse, a docker who tried to alert others about a ship's unstable cargo, a railway worker who reported track damage hours before a derailment. In each case, Margaret continued, the person who gave the warning was from the working class, and the people who ignored them were either supervisors, property owners, or middle-class residents. It's as though there was a systematic devaluing of working-class knowledge and intuition. Eleanor studied the timeline with growing interest. This is remarkable work, Dr. Thorne. I've seen individual cases before, but never mapped out like this. What made you think to look for this pattern? Margaret hesitated. How much could she reveal without sounding delusional? The Harwick case was so compelling, his determination to keep warning people even when they threatened him. It made me wonder if his experience was unique or part of a broader social phenomenon. And what have you concluded? That Victorian London was full of people like William Harwick, workers whose lives depended on intimate knowledge of their environments, who could detect dangers that others missed. But because of class prejudice, their warnings were often dismissed until it was too late. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, clearly impressed. This could be groundbreaking research. Have you considered expanding it into a book? The Unheeded Warnings or something like that? Margaret felt a thrill of excitement. This was the kind of historical work she had always dreamed of doing, research that revealed hidden patterns and gave voice to the forgotten. I'd love to, but I need more primary sources. Letters, diaries, personal accounts that show how these workers experienced their warnings being ignored. Well, you're in luck, Eleanor said with a smile. We've just acquired a new collection of Victorian working-class documents from a private estate, mostly unpublished material, letters, journals, workplace records. I haven't had time to catalog it all yet, but I remember seeing several items related to industrial accidents and safety concerns. She led Margaret to a storage room where dozens of archival boxes were stacked on metal shelving. The donor was a collector who specialized in what he called voices from below, documents by and about working-class people. He was particularly interested in cases where workers had tried to prevent disasters. Margaret's pulse quickened. It was as though the universe was conspiring to help her research, providing exactly the materials she needed just when she needed them. Eleanor pulled down a box labeled Industrial Safety and Worker Warnings, 1870 to 1880, and set it on a nearby table. Take your time with these. If you find anything useful, we can discuss reproduction rights and citation permissions. Margaret opened the box with trembling hands. The first document was a letter written by a factory foreman to his wife, dated March 1874. My dearest Mary, I write this in great distress of mind. Today I was forced to dismiss young Tommy Fletcher from the mill, though he is a good worker and supports his widowed mother. His crime? He insisted the new steam engine was improperly installed and would cause an explosion. Mr. Cartwright would hear none of it and accused Tommy of spreading panic among the workers. Yet I confess, the boy's concerns seem well-founded. The engine does vibrate strangely, and there is a smell of hot metal that was not there before. The letter was never finished. A note clipped to it explained that the mill had exploded 5 days later, killing 14 workers, including the foreman who wrote the letter. Tommy Fletcher survived because he was no longer employed there. Margaret photographed the letter with her phone and continued through the box. Document after document told the same story. Working people who detected danger, tried to warn others, and were ignored or punished for their efforts. Many of the disasters they predicted came to pass exactly as they had feared. But it was near the bottom of the box that Margaret found the document that made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped it. It was a journal entry written by someone named Mrs. Adelaide Foster, dated November 1873. I cannot shake the memory of that terrible night at Cartwright Gardens. Poor Mr. Harwick, the lamplighter, seemed so desperate to warn us all. I have learned since that he had been detecting the gas leak for days, but no one would listen to him. The tragedy might have been prevented if we had not been so quick to dismiss his concerns as the ravings of a working man. But here is the strangest thing. Since the explosion, I have seen him again. Not in person, of course. The dear man is dead and buried. But sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of a pale figure in a felt hat, standing beneath the street lamps with his hand raised in warning. The other survivors have seen him too, though we rarely speak of it. It is as though his spirit cannot rest, still trying to protect people from dangers they cannot perceive themselves. I have decided to document these sightings in hopes that someday someone might understand what poor Mr. Harwick was trying to tell us. If his warnings were accurate in life, perhaps they remain so in death. The journal contained dozens more entries.
Oh, dozens over the years. Maybe 50 or 60 in total. Always in the same general area. Bloomsbury, King's Cross, parts of Camden. Always gas leaks that conventional detection methods had missed, and always reported by people who seemed genuinely frightened, like they'd seen something that spooked them. Margaret felt her excitement building. Did any of the callers ever describe what they had seen? Not usually on the phone. People don't like to sound crazy to emergency services. But when I met them in person, some would mention a pale man in old-fashioned clothes, standing near their building with his hand raised like he was trying to warn them. Most were embarrassed to admit it, but after a while, you start to recognize the pattern. And you found gas leaks in all these cases? Every single one. Often in places where leaks shouldn't have been possible. Old lines that had been capped for decades. Modern installations that should have been perfectly safe. It was like something was drawing attention to problems that no one else could detect. Margaret arranged to meet with Robert Henley the following day. He had promised to bring some of his old case files, as well as contact information for other retired gas workers who might remember the Harwick Protocol. As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized that her research had evolved far beyond academic history. She was documenting an active phenomenon, a supernatural early warning system that had been protecting London residents for over a century. William Harwick's ghost wasn't just a historical curiosity. He was an ongoing guardian, still making his rounds after all these years. But that raised new questions. If William was still appearing to people, still warning them of gas leaks, why had he seemed to retreat when she left Cartwright Gardens? Had his work there been completed, or was there something else he needed her to understand? Chapter 7. The Network. Robert Henley lived in a neat terraced house in Islington, surrounded by the kind of organized chaos that only comes from decades of professional record-keeping. His sitting room was lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves, and the coffee table was covered with manila folders that he had pulled from his personal archives. I kept copies of everything, he explained as he poured tea. Company policy said we were supposed to destroy records after 7 years, but I never could bring myself to do it. Too many close calls. Too many lives saved by taking the unusual cases seriously. Margaret examined the files he had prepared. Each contained detailed incident reports, photographs of gas leaks, and hand-drawn maps showing the exact locations where problems had been found. The thoroughness was impressive, even by academic standards. "This is extraordinary record-keeping," she said. "Most companies don't maintain this level of detail." "Ah, but these weren't ordinary cases," Robert replied. "The Harwick reports were different. They required special documentation because they often involved situations that shouldn't have been possible. Gas leaks in lines that had been decommissioned for decades. Dangerous accumulations in buildings with modern safety systems. We needed to understand why these particular locations were so prone to problems." He opened the first file and showed her a map of central London, with dozens of red pins marking reported incidents. Margaret immediately noticed that they clustered around specific areas: Bloomsbury, Fitzrovia, parts of Marylebone, and Camden. "Do you see the pattern?" Robert asked. Margaret studied the map more carefully. The pins seemed to follow the routes of Victorian-era gas mains, the original infrastructure that had been built in the 1860s and 1870s. "It's the old gas network," she said. "The original Metropolitan Gas Works distribution system." "Exactly. And if you overlay this with historical records." He pulled out a second map, this one showing the locations where Victorian gas workers had died in industrial accidents. You get an almost perfect correlation. The two maps were nearly identical. Every cluster of modern Harwick reports corresponded to an area where gas workers had died in the 19th century. It was as though the ghosts of multiple workers were continuing their safety rounds, each covering the territory they had known in life. "Robert, this suggests that William Harwick wasn't the only one. There might be other gas workers still active." That was my conclusion, too. I started researching the history of every location where I'd encountered unusual reports. In almost every case, I found records of Victorian gas workers who had died trying to prevent accidents or protect public safety. He showed her file after file of such cases. Thomas Bradley, who had died in a gas explosion in Fitzrovia in 1876 while trying to shut off a main valve.